The morning of her daughter's wedding, Sir Dorothy Keller woke at 4:45 and lay still in the dark of a bed that had been too wide for 3 years. She did not cry. She had decided somewhere in the second year of sleeping alone that mornings were not for crying. Mornings were for getting up. Harold had taught her that without meaning to the way he taught her most of the things that lasted. He had been a man who got up. Whatever the night had done to him, whatever ache or worry or grief the dark had stirred, Harold Keller rose at 5, put his feet on the floor and made coffee for 2. Even after the children left home, even after his brother Ray moved into the facility down the road. He made 2 cups every single morning. She had never asked him why. She thought she understood now. She made 1 cup. She stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse outside Dayton and watched the September light come up gray and slow across the east field. Cassie's wedding would be here on this land in the old red barn that Harold's father had built in 1953 and that Harold and his brother Ray had repainted together the summer Ray turned 40. That had been a good summer. Ray had loved painting. The roller, the repetition, the long clean strokes across old wood. He had painted that barn with the focused intensity of a man diffusing something, and Harold had worked beside him, quietly handing him the tray when it ran low, never rushing, never filling the silence with words Ray didn't need. Dorothy had watched them from the same window. She had been 52 that summer. Her hands around a coffee cup she hadn't bothered to count anymore. She had worked the pediatric ward at Mercy General for 31 years by then, and she had learned things about quiet that most people never learn. How it could be a kindness, how it could be a wall, how the difference between the two was whether the person beside you was working to stay or working to leave. Harold was always working to stay. She missed him in a way that had no drama to it. It was not the sharp grief of the first year, the kind that could ambush you in the bread aisle when you reached for the kind he liked. It was a low and constant thing now, like the hum of a refrigerator. You didn't notice it until the room went quiet enough. She set her cup in the sink and turned on the light above the stove. There was a list on the counter. Cassie had made it and left it there 2 days ago, written in her daughter's careful architect's handwriting, each item in a small, neat box with a line through it when done. Most of the boxes had lines. The chairs for the ceremony had been set up yesterday in the south field by the rental company. The caterer had confirmed, the florist had delivered, and the barn smelled now like eucalyptus and white roses when you pushed open the heavy door. Dorothy had checked last night, walking the length of it slowly, with a flashlight touching the edge of each table as she passed. Round tables, cream cloth, low candles. Harold's barn made into something Cassie had been drawing in notebooks since she was 16. Dorothy had sat down in one of the ceremony chairs for a few minutes in the dark. She had not told anyone. She poured herself a second cup and took it to the porch, wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders against the early chill. The farm was quiet. The wedding would not begin until 3 in the afternoon, but the day had already started moving in her chest the way important days did. She had felt this on the morning of Cassie's birth. On the morning they brought Ray to Sunview Gardens, for the first time Harold's jaw set, and his hands white on the steering wheel, Ray in the back seat holding a spiral notebook he'd had since 1987. On the morning Harold died in room 14 of Mercy General, her own hospital where she had walked the halls for 3 decades and suddenly could not find a single wall to lean on. You got through important days the same way you got through everything else. One thing at a time. Feet on the floor. She went inside and started on her hair. The guests began arriving at 2. Dorothy stood near the barn entrance and directed people towards seats with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her career in places where calm was the difference between things going well and things going badly. She had dressed carefully. A sage green dress she had bought in Columbus last spring for no particular reason, and then found appropriate for this particular one. Low heels. Harold's watch on her wrist because Cassie had asked her to wear it, and because she would have anyway. She recognized most of the guests. Cassie's friends from the firm in Cincinnati, college roommates, the neighbors who had watched Cassie grow up on this land. Dorothy's sister Ruth and her husband Glenn, who had driven down from Cleveland and who hugged Dorothy too long at the gate and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing to do. There were guests she did not know, the groom's family mostly. Connor Briggs was a good man, steady and earnest, a structural engineer who had proposed to Cassie on the roof of a building he'd designed in downtown Cincinnati and then called Dorothy to ask if he'd done it right. She had told him he had done it exactly right. His family came from Dayton as well, which was why the wedding was here instead of Cincinnati. a compromise that had taken 4 months to negotiate, and that Dorothy had watched Cassie manage with the methodical grace of someone who had learned early that most things worth having require you to give something up. The Briggs side filled in the right half of the chairs. Dorothy watched them settle. She noticed the man and the boy because they came late, and because the boy came first. Not first in time, first in the way Dorothy had been noticing certain children since she was 23 years old and standing in a pediatric ward trying to understand what the textbooks had not told her about the space between a child and the rest of the world. She noticed them the way she had always noticed them, a particular quality of attention. The way the boy came through the gate and immediately stopped, both feet planted, head moving slowly to take in the chairs and the people and the lanterns, strung from the fence posts and the movement of fabric in the small breeze. He was cataloging. She knew that motion. Ray had done it every time they walked into a new place. Not hesitation, inventory. He needed to know the shape of the room before he could be inside it. He was 8, maybe 9. Brown hair cut short on the sides and left longer on top. He was wearing a button-down shirt the color of a faded sky and dark pants and shoes that someone had polished with care. He had a small object in his right hand, something pale and rectangular, and his grip on it was the grip of a child holding the thing that makes the rest of the world manageable. The man behind him was large enough that Dorothy registered him the way you register weather. 6'2", maybe more. Wide across the shoulders in the particular way that comes not from a gym, but from years of physical labor, from lifting and carrying, and the daily demands of a body put to use. His hair was dark, going to gray at the temples. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, and dark trousers and boots that were clean, but belonged to a different kind of occasion. He carried a small backpack over one shoulder, the kind children use for school. On his right forearm was a tattoo she could see from 20 feet away, a compass rose, and she knew without looking that there were others. He had his hand near the boy's shoulder, not on it, near it. They found seats on the far left of the arrangement, the edge of the outside aisle, which Dorothy thought was wise. The boy sat and immediately looked at the ground, then at the sky, then at his hands. The man sat beside him and put the backpack between his feet and did not look at anyone else in the chairs. The ceremony was beautiful. Cassie had written her own vows as Dorothy had known she would. She had a gift for clarity, for saying the exact things she meant in the exact number of words it required, neither more nor fewer. Connor cried a little during hers, which Dorothy had not expected of him, and which made her like him considerably more than she already did. Ruth cried loudly enough that Glenn put his arm around her, and Dorothy smiled at the sky. She did not cry herself. Harold's watch was warm on her wrist. She looked once at the man and the boy during the vows. The boy had the small object in his lap, now turning it over and over in his hands, a block of some kind, wood, pale and smooth-edged. He was not looking at the ceremony. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, the place where people go when the outside world is running too fast and the inside world needs tending. The man watched the ceremony and watched his son in alternating glances, a rhythm so practiced it was almost invisible. When Connor kissed Cassie and the guests applauded, the boy flinched. His shoulders came up and his hands tightened on the wooden block. The man's hand moved immediately to the backpack and came out with a small set of headphones, which he held up for the boy to see. The boy looked at them, looked at his father, shook his head, put the block in his lap, breathed. He was managing. Dorothy watched him decide to manage and felt something in her chest that was not exactly sadness and not exactly recognition, but lived somewhere between the two. The reception moved into the barn at 4:30. Dorothy had planned for the transition, carefully had spoken to the caterer and the DJ, both about the first hour keeping the music low while guests found their tables. It was a thing she had not mentioned to Cassie, not wanting to make the day about her own preferences. But she had managed it quietly the way she managed most things. She moved through this barn with the ease of a woman on her own land. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and held it rather than drank it. She kept one part of her attention on the tables the way she had once kept one part of her attention on the monitors at the nurse's station, listening for the note that was different from the rest. She found the man and the boy at table 14. It was on the far north wall of the barn, set slightly apart from the others by the placement of a support post. Dorothy had quietly arranged for that table to have only 4 settings instead of 8. She had told the caterer it was for late guests. She had known it was for whoever needed the distance. She had not known who that would be. She did not go to them immediately. She watched from across the room. The boy was seated with his back to the wall, the wooden block on the table in front of him. He had a glass of water he was not drinking. He was watching the room with his careful inventory gaze, but the barn was louder now. Conversation and the scrape of chairs and the low beginning notes of the DJ's cue, and she could see the effort in his stillness. The man had not sat down. He stood behind the boy's chair with his hand resting on the back of it, not touching his son just near. He was scanning the room in a different way, the way people scan rooms when they are calculating exits and threats and distances. Dorothy had seen that look before, not in hospitals, but in the faces of parents who had spent years being the only thing standing between their child and a world that did not accommodate them. She went to find Cassie. Her daughter was moving through the room with the measured joy of a woman who had spent 18 months planning exactly this and was now inside it. Dorothy touched her elbow and drew her aside. "Table 14, Dorothy said. "The boy with the father. Do you know them?" Cassie looked toward the table. "That's Wade Holloway. He's one of Connor's cousins. Second cousin, maybe. I've only met him twice." She paused. "The boy is his son, Noah. His mother isn't in the picture. Wade raises him alone. Does Connor know them well?" "Not very. Wade's been to a couple of family things. He's quiet. Connor said he rides motorcycles, that he's in some kind of club." Cassie looked at Dorothy with the slightly careful expression she had been wearing since the funeral, the expression that asked, without asking, if her mother was all right. "Why?" "No reason," Dorothy said. "Just getting to know the room." Cassie looked at her a moment longer, then leaned in and kissed her cheek. "Thank you for this. For all of this." "It's your father's barn," Dorothy said. "I just kept it standing." She made her way to table 14 and stopped about 6 feet from them, the distance she had used for 30 years when approaching a child who did not know her, close enough to be in conversation range, far enough not to require anything. She said to the father rather than the boy, "I'm Dorothy Keller, Cassie's mother. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed at this table." The man looked at her with a measuring look. Up close, his face was older than his body suggested, not in age but in the way of faces that have been through things. He had a scar along his left jaw, pale and long-heeled. His eyes were dark brown and direct. "Wade Holloway," he said. "This is my son Noah." He said the name with the weight of a man who has introduced his son into uncertain situations many times and has learned to watch what happens next. Dorothy did not look immediately at Noah. She kept her eyes on Wade for one more second, just long enough to let him see that she was not going to make any face she didn't intend. Then she shifted her gaze to the boy and looked at him the way she had looked at children in the pediatric ward for 3 decades. Without pity, without performance. Just looking. "Hello, Noah," she said. She did not say anything else. She did not ask how old he was or if he was having fun. She just said his name and let the silence stay comfortable. Noah looked up from the wooden block. His eyes were hazel large with the particular focus quality she associated with children who were paying more attention to the world than the world suspected. He looked at her face the way he had been looking at the room, cataloging. Then he looked back at the block. She said to both of them, "The table by the post is quieter than most of the room. The music won't be as loud here when the DJ moves it up. The caterers tend to come around less often, so if you need anything, send someone to find me and I'll get it." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said like a man unused to saying it. Dorothy nodded and stepped back 1 step. "I'll leave you be, but I'll be nearby." She moved through the room and kept one part of herself pointed at table 14. The first dance happened at 20 past 5. Cassie and Connor moved to the center of the floor, to a song Dorothy had heard Cassie play in the car for a year and a half. The room gathered around the edges and watched with a collective softness people only allow themselves in certain moments. Dorothy stood with Ruth and watched her daughter be happy with a man who deserved it, and she pressed her thumb against Harold's watch and did not look away. Then the DJ said the words that start the second part of every reception. "All right, everybody, let's get this party moving." The volume went up, not a gradual climb, but a step change the way DJs do it when they want a room to shift. The bass came in through the floor. The fidgeting and warming up of the dance floor began. Dorothy was already moving. She had been near the barn entrance getting a shawl when the music shifted, and she moved back through the room toward table 14 the way she moved through the pediatric ward when a monitor changed pitch. Not running, purposeful and quiet and faster than it looked. She saw it before she reached them. One of the groomsmen, Connor's brother, large and generous, and 3 drinks into the celebration, threw his arm out in a gesture of enthusiasm at the precise moment a passing caterer crossed his trajectory with a tray of champagne flutes. 3 glasses went. They hit the barn floor in a cascade of sound, a sharp, bright crash, and then the tinkle of shards across old wood. The sound was nothing in the context of the room. The music was loud. There was laughter and apology, the caterer already crouching to gather pieces. For Noah, it was everything. The sound hit him the way certain sounds hit children who have no buffer between hearing and reaction. His chair pushed back from the table. He was on his feet before Dorothy was within 10 steps. The wooden block fell from his hands, hit the floor, slid under the table. His hands went to his ears, pressed hard, and he was making a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a word, high and tight, coming from somewhere behind his teeth. Wade was already moving. He was around the table in 2 strides, crouching, saying Noah's name in a low voice, his hands held out and open. But Noah was looking at the barn door, the large double door Dorothy had propped open to let in the September air. And in the body of this boy, she could see the decision forming the way a child decides that the only option left is to run. Dorothy stepped in front of the barn door. She did not block it. She stood 6 feet in front of it between Noah and the exit, not threatening, just present. She stopped, put her hands at her sides, open palms showing. Noah's gaze hit her and stuck. She looked at him the way she had looked at him at the table. Without pity, without urgency, just looking. She breathed slowly and let the breath be visible, the rise and fall of her shoulders so he could see it. "That was very loud," she said. "I know." Her voice was not loud. It cut through the noise of the room the way certain voices cut, not through volume but through frequency. "That kind of sound goes right through you," she said. Noah's hands were still over his ears, but he had not moved toward the door. He was watching her. Wade had risen from his crouch. He was behind his son, far enough back not to crowd him close enough to be there. His eyes were on Dorothy with an expression she could not entirely read, wariness and something that might have been hope. The combination that parents wore when an unexpected stranger was either about to make things better or very much worse. Dorothy did not break Noah's eye contact. "I had someone in my family," she said. "He was grown, not a little boy, but loud sounds were hard for him too. Sometimes we would go to the kitchen when things got too big in the room. It was quieter in there." She paused. "We have a kitchen in the back of this barn. It's where the caterers come from. It's quiet and it smells like food, and there are no people in it right now except the caterers, and they're very calm people. If you wanted to come see it, I would take you." Noah's hands came down from his ears. Not all the way. Halfway, palms against his cheeks, a transition posture. She recognized the place between full protection and the willingness to hear. He said something, very low. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't hear you." He said it a little louder. "Did he come with you?" She did not know for a moment who he meant. Then she understood. "My person who didn't like loud sounds." Noah nodded. "No," she said. "He died a few years ago. Before that, he lived here on this farm with me and my husband for a long time." Noah looked at her steadily. "Was he old?" "He was 58 when he died. His name was Ray." "That's not very old." "No," Dorothy said. "It wasn't." Noah's hands came the rest of the way down. He reached under the table with one foot, a precise blind gesture, and knocked the wooden block back within reach. He bent and picked it up without looking away from her. He said, "Can I see the kitchen?" Wade said quietly from behind, "You don't have to, bud." Noah looked back at his father, then at Dorothy. "I want to," he said. Dorothy stepped to the side of the door to the kitchen corridor, not leading, just indicating direction, and Noah walked toward her and then past her, and she fell into step beside him a little behind, and Wade followed with the backpack over one shoulder. Behind them, the music played on and the barn filled, and the people who had briefly stopped returned to what they were doing. The kitchen corridor behind the barn was a short passage that opened into a catering staging area, warm lit with fluorescent work lights, smelling of roasted chicken and herb bread. 2 caterers looked up when Dorothy came through. "We need a quiet corner for a few minutes," Dorothy said. The young woman immediately moved a crate to open a space near the far wall, where a stool and a low counter created something like a corner. Noah walked to it without being directed. He sat on the stool and put the wooden block on the counter and looked at it. Wade stood near the entrance to the corridor watching his son. Dorothy pulled up a folding chair at the distance she had calculated by watching children for 30 years, and she sat down. For a while, nobody said anything. The noise of the barn was muffled here, reduced to a bass pulse in the shape of music rather than music itself. The kitchen sounds were steady, a quiet hum of refrigeration, the soft movement of the caterers working around them with consideration. Noah turned the wooden block over in his hands. It was pale, engraved on one face with letters she could not see from this distance. She said, "What does it say on your block?" He held it up. The engraving was simple, careful lettering Noah. Beneath that smaller, a phone number. "My dad made it," Noah said. He said it with the matter-of-fact pride of a child who considers this simply a true and important thing. "It's very well made," Dorothy said. "He makes things, at the shop, motorcycle things. But he made this too. What's the phone number for? If I get too far away from him, so whoever finds me can call." He said it simply without embarrassment, in the way of children who have been told practical truths about their own needs and have decided those truths are just part of the inventory of the world. Dorothy looked at the block. She said, "My husband used to carry something like that for his brother." Not a block. A card he kept in his shirt pocket with Ray's name and our phone number. Ray used to forget the number sometimes when he was in a new place. Noah looked at her. Did Ray carry a block? He had a notebook. He carried it every day for 40 years. It had spiral binding and a green cover. He wrote things in it and drew things. When he was upset, he would trace the spirals with his finger. The same spiral around and around until things were the right size again. Noah considered this. "I have a block. It's better than a notebook. It doesn't have pages that bend." "I can see how that would be better," Dorothy said. Wade had come a few feet closer. He was leaning against the wall of the corridor, arms folded watching. His face was doing something difficult to describe the face of a man who has braced so long for certain kinds of things that unexpected other things catch him without preparation. Dorothy said to Wade, shifting slightly, so he was included without Noah feeling the conversation move away from him. "His name was Raymond Harold Keller, my husband's younger brother. He lived with us for 19 years. He was my patient first when he was 31 and came to Mercy General for a respiratory thing, and we sorted out some things that had not been sorted out properly before that. Then he was our family." She paused. "He died 8 years ago." Wade said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "He had a very good life for a long time. Better than it might have been." She looked at the wooden block in Noah's hands. "My husband made sure of that. Harold was very good at staying beside a person without making them feel followed." She did not look at Wade when she said that, but he was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he had heard something in the sentence that she had not precisely intended to put there and had put there anyway. Noah said, "Is Harold here tonight?" "No," she said. "Harold died 3 years ago. He's why this wedding is here on this land in that barn. This was his place." Noah looked at the block in his hands, then at her. "Do you miss him?" "Every day," she said. "I miss my mom," Noah said. "She doesn't come to things." Wade's arms tightened where they were folded. Dorothy did not fill the silence. She let it exist the way she had learned to let difficult silences exist in rooms where children were working through things too large for the quick comfort of words. After a moment, Noah said, "She didn't want to come. She said it was too much." He turned the block over. "Dad says that's okay, that some things are too much for some people." "Your father is right," Dorothy said. "Is that true for everyone, that some things are too much?" "Yes," she said, "for everyone, even people who look like nothing is ever too much." Noah looked at her with his still eyes. "Is tonight too much for you?" Dorothy was quiet for 3 seconds. The question deserved honesty. "Parts of it," she said. "My husband isn't here to see his daughter get married. That part is too much. But I'm managing it." "How?" "I stay busy. I find things that need doing. And I carry something of his." She showed him the watch on her wrist, tilted it so the light caught the face. Noah leaned forward slightly to look at it. Then he held up the wooden block showing her the engraved side. "This is mine," he said. "Yes," she said, "I see that." For the first time that evening, at the edge of his mouth, something moved. It was not quite a smile. It was stiller than a smile, but it was something. From the barn muffled through the wall, the music shifted to something slower. Dorothy said, "They're moving to slower songs. The room will be quieter for a while. Would you like to go back in and find your table? I can walk with you." Noah looked at his father. Wade said, "Up to you, bud." Noah looked at the wooden block, turned it once, tucked it against his palm. "Okay," he said. They walked back through the corridor, Dorothy on Noah's left, Wade behind them, and pushed through the barn door into the warm gold light and the slower music. and found their way back to table 14 by the post, and Noah sat down with his block in front of him and looked at the room with his cataloging gaze, and Dorothy watched him settle the way she had watched Ray settle in new places, the slow release of held breath, the shoulders coming down a measured half-inch. She said to Wade, "I'll be nearby," the way she had said it before. Wade looked at her. He said slowly, like a man choosing words from a short supply, "Thank you for the kitchen, for talking to him." "He's easy to talk to," Dorothy said. Wade looked at his son, then back at her. Something was working behind his face that she did not yet have the context to read. He said, "Most people don't." He stopped. "He doesn't usually." "He told me about Ray's notebook," Dorothy said. "And he told me he prefers the block because it doesn't have pages that bend. I thought that was very good reasoning." Wade looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, and she saw something move through his jaw, the hard clench and release of a man who has been carrying something for a long time in a body that was built to hold more than it should have to. "Yeah," he said, "it is." Dorothy left them to their table and moved back through the room. The evening found its pace. The food was served and the toasts were made, and Cassie laughed at something Connor said that Dorothy could not hear from where she stood, but that transformed her daughter's face in the way she had been watching since Cassie was 3 years old. Ruth cried again. The dancing started properly at 8, and by 9 the barn floor was full and warm with it. Dorothy danced once with Connor's father, a quiet man named Ed, who moved with the careful dignity of someone who had not danced in years and was taking it seriously. She thanked him and meant it, and stepped back to the side of the room. She checked table 14 twice. Both times Noah was there, block in hand, watching the room with his steady inventory gaze. Both times Wade was nearby, standing rather than sitting the backpack on the chair beside Noah. The second time she checked, Noah looked up and saw her looking and gave a small nod that she returned. At 9:30 the music slowed again for a series of quieter songs, and Dorothy found herself near the barn door, letting the September air come in and thinking about Harold without trying to, and deciding that was all right. She heard someone come up beside her and turned. It was Wade. He had his leather jacket now, the one that had been folded over the back of his chair, and she saw for the first time the patch on the back. Ironbound MC in white thread on a dark ground, and a compass rose, the same compass rose as the tattoo on his forearm. He was holding 2 bottles of water and offered her one. She took it. He stood beside her and looked at the barn, at the lights and the people, and the slow movement of couples on the floor. He said, "Noah's asleep in the chair." She looked toward table 14. The boy had his arms on the table and his head on his arms, the wooden block tucked against his chest, asleep with the completeness of children who have held themselves together through hard things and finally let go. "He made it through the whole evening," Wade said. He said it quietly with something that was not pride exactly, but was in the same territory, the satisfaction of a thing accomplished. "He did well," Dorothy said. Wade was quiet. The music played. People moved on the floor. He said, "The last wedding we went to, he didn't make it past the ceremony. We left before the reception. He was 7. That was a hard night. He took a drink of water. Tonight he lasted 3 hours. He ate. He talked to you. He went back to the table." He paused. "I don't know what you did in there." "I didn't do anything," Dorothy said. "I just talked to him." "You know how to talk to him." He said it carefully, more as an observation he was still working out than a compliment. "Most people don't." "I had practice," Dorothy said. She looked at the ironbound MC patch. "How long have you been in Dayton?" Something shifted in his attention. "All my life. My father's in Dayton. My whole family is here." He looked at her. "Why," Dorothy said, "the ironbound MC, my husband used to talk about them." Wade looked at her. "He had an encounter with someone from your club," Dorothy said. "A long time ago. He talked about it until the day he died." Wade was very still. "November of 1999, Dorothy said, "a stretch of Route 40 outside of Vandalia." She said it and watched his face, and what she saw, there was something she had not expected and could not entirely interpret, a sequence of things moving through a face that had been trained to hold still, like weather coming across open country. He said very carefully, "What did your husband tell you about that night?" And Dorothy looked at him and understood that she was standing at the edge of something larger than a wedding, larger than an evening, something that had been moving toward this moment for 25 years, through the corridors of other people's lives. She said, "Why don't we sit down?" They sat on the low bench just outside the barn door, the one Harold had built from a split log 30 years ago, and that Dorothy had never replaced because it sat exactly right and because she saw no reason to replace things that still did what they were meant to do. The September air was cool now. Inside the barn, the music played on, and the voices were warm with it. Out here, there were only the lanterns on the fence posts in the dark of the east field and the stars coming in over the tree line. Wade sat with his forearms on his knees and his water bottle held in both hands and was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone gathering a lie. The quiet of someone gathering facts he had not expected to need tonight. He said, "In 1999, I was 23 years old, and I was stupid in the way 23-year-olds are stupid when they have never been shown another way to be. I had come into the Ironbound MC 2 years before that, younger than I should have been, because my father was in it and his father had been in it, and because it was the only structure I had ever seen that looked like it might hold me. My father was not well then. He drank. Not mean drunk, just gone drunk. There and then, not there, and the club filled in the gaps. He took a drink of water. I was riding back from Columbus one night in November. Drunk, which I'm not proud of. I went off Route 40 on a curve I thought I knew and didn't. Came off the bike, went down an embankment, couldn't get up. It was cold. I mean cold the way November in Ohio is cold, when you're lying in a ditch on wet ground and your bike is on its side and you can't feel your left leg below the knee. Dorothy was very still. I was there about 40 minutes, maybe more. It was almost midnight. Nobody was stopping. And then headlights. He looked at the east field. A truck, an old Ford dark blue one headlight that wasn't quite aimed right. It pulled over and a man got out. Dorothy's thumb moved to Harold's watch. He came down the embankment without a flashlight. Just came down. He got me up and he got the bike up, which took him a long time because he was not a young man and the bike was heavier than he expected and he did not complain once. He drove me to a gas station on Route 40 about 4 miles east. He gave me his jacket because I was shaking. He bought me coffee from the machine inside. He gave me $60 and told me to call someone. He stopped. Dorothy said, "What did the jacket look like?" Wade turned his head slowly. "Tell me what the jacket looked like," she said again. Her voice was very steady. "Green. Dark green with a collar that folded up. It was old. Had some kind of wear on the left cuff like it had caught something once. A small tear repaired." He looked at her. "I kept that jacket for 11 years. I wore it out. When it finally went, I kept a piece of the lining." Dorothy looked at this barn, at the string lights through the open door, at the shape of the building Harold's grandfather had built and Harold had painted one summer with his brother Ray. She said, "Harold bought that jacket at a hardware store in 1987. He wore it every winter for years. He had it repaired twice. He lost it in November of 1999, and he never said how, only that he gave it to someone who needed it more." She paused. "I asked him once years later whether he regretted giving it away. He said it was the best use he'd ever gotten out of a piece of clothing." Wade was not moving. "He told me about you," Dorothy said. "He didn't know your name. He said a young man, a motorcycle rider, went off Route 40 on a cold night. He said when he got down to him, the young man had been lying in the dark for the better part of an hour, and he was cold to the bone, and his pride was hurt worse than his leg. He said he drove him to the gas station and called the tow company from the payphone, and that by the time the tow arrived, the young man was warm enough to look embarrassed, which Harold took as a good sign." She looked at Wade. "He said the young man thanked him and shook his hand, and the grip was strong, and Harold thought that was also a good sign. He prayed about that young man off and on for a long time afterward. He hoped the young man had straightened out." Wade's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the light. "He straightened out," Wade said. "It came out rough." "I know," Dorothy said. "I can tell." He laughed at that, a short, broken sound that had surprise in it. She said, "Harold was a very ordinary man. He pumped ass for 32 years. He had a brother he loved and a daughter he was proud of and a wife he was patient with, even when she was difficult to be patient with. He read 3 books a year and he never met one he thought was entirely wasted. He died on a Tuesday in February with his hand in mine." She looked at the field. "And he pulled a stranger out of a ditch on Route 40 and he never made it into a story or a lesson. He just did it and came home, and I asked him where his jacket was, and he said he gave it to someone." Wade pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. He breathed. "I came out of both that ditch differently," he said finally. "The way he came down that embankment without a light and without asking questions. Like it was just the obvious thing to do, like there was no version of that night where he didn't stop. I had never seen anyone model that, what it looked like to just stop. He shook his head slowly. I got sober the following year. I stayed in the club, but I changed the way I was in it. I've been the man I tried to become because of that one night. The music from inside was something slow and sweet. And your son, Dorothy said. He looked at her. The way you come down the embankment, she said, without a flashlight, without asking questions. He was very quiet. The lanterns moved in the slight night breeze. After a while, he said, he doesn't know any of this. He doesn't need to, Dorothy said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Children don't need the origin story. They just need the version of you that came out of it. They sat there for a long time. At one point, Cassie came to the door and looked out, saw her mother on the bench with a guest, and gave Dorothy a questioning look. Dorothy shook her head slightly. Cassie nodded and went back in. Eventually, Wade said, I should wake him up. We have a long drive. He's sleeping soundly, Dorothy said. A few more minutes won't hurt. Wade looked at the field. I don't know what to do with this. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, Dorothy said. Harold helped you because it was obvious. You've spent 25 years becoming the man he expected you already were. That's not something you need to solve. That's just something to know. He looked at her for a moment. In the warm, uncertain light, his face was very open. The manufactured hardness of it gone, and she could see in it something younger, the face of a man who had been lucky enough to be interrupted at 23. He said, thank you for telling me. Dorothy said Harold would have liked you. Wade said, I would have liked to meet him. He would have made you coffee, she said. He always made coffee for two. She stood and he stood, and they went back into the barn to wake the boy and gather his things and find the jacket and the backpack and say the proper goodnights. And by 10:30, the Holloway truck was pulling down the long drive away from the farm, with Noah asleep in the back seat and the wooden block tucked under his chin, and Dorothy stood at the fence in her sage green dress, watching the taillights until they were gone. Then she turned back toward the barn and her daughter and the last of the evening that was still warm and waiting for her. She put her thumb on Harold's watch. She went inside. The week after the wedding was ordinary, in the way weeks can be when something large has happened inside them and the world hasn't caught up yet. Dorothy cleaned the barn with Ruth's help on Sunday morning, the two of them moving through the empty space in the particular comfortable silence of sisters who have been cleaning up after things together for 50 years. The cream tablecloths went into bags for the rental company. The flower arrangements Dorothy cut down and distributed between the kitchen and the porch, and the small room off the hall that had been Harold's study, where she kept them until they were finished. The chairs came back to their rows along the wall, the way Harold had always kept them. She thought about Wade Holloway while she stacked chairs. She thought about what he had told her and what she had told him, and the particular feeling of a circle closing that you had not known was open. She had not wept about it. She did not think she would. It was not a sad thing. Harold had done a good thing on a cold night 25 years ago, and the consequences of that good thing were standing in a barn in a leather jacket. The consequences of that good thing had a son named Noah who carried a wooden block with his phone number on it and preferred it to a notebook because it did not have pages that bent. Harold would have found that logical. She found herself smiling at the chair in her hands and set it down and went to get another. Ruth left at noon. Dorothy ate lunch alone on the porch with the September light going amber in the east field and Harold's watch on her wrist and the faint smell of eucalyptus still coming through the barn door. She did not expect to hear from Wade Holloway. She had given him nothing to contact her with. He had her name and the name of the farm, but those things added up to a general direction rather than an address. The call came on Thursday. She had been deadheading the garden along the east fence, the late summer work of clearing spent blooms so the plants could put their energy somewhere useful. It was the kind of gardening that looked futile to people who didn't understand plants, cutting away everything that had already flowered, and Dorothy had always found it restful for exactly that reason. The work of accepting what was finished. Her phone was in her apron pocket. The number was local Dayton area code, but not one she recognized. She pulled off one glove and answered. Mrs. Keller. His voice was low, careful. This is Wade Holloway from the wedding. I know who you are, she said. How did you find my number? Connor gave it to me. I hope that's all right. It's all right. She tucked the phone against her shoulder and pulled the other glove off. How is Noah? A pause. The pause was longer than a social pause. That's actually why I'm calling. He stopped. Started again. My father had a heart event on Monday. He's at Miami Valley Hospital. They're saying it's serious. I've been there most of the week. Dorothy was still in the garden. I'm sorry, she said. Noah is having a hard time. My dad, Hank, he's the one person Noah will go to when things are too big. More than me sometimes. He and Noah have a particular thing. My dad has a lot of patience and a lot of quiet. Noah trusts him completely. Yes, Dorothy said. She understood. She had seen it with Ray, who had been unmoved by most social overtures, but had trusted Harold with a completeness that was almost structural. Noah's not eating, Wade said. He's not talking much. He keeps asking to go to the hospital, and I take him, and he sits in the waiting room and holds his block and won't come inside the room because the ICU has a lot of sounds. He won't leave either. He just sits there. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know why I'm calling you. Then flatly correcting himself, that's not true. I know why. I'm not accustomed to asking. To asking for what? Dorothy said. Help, he said, like the word had spent some time getting past his teeth. Dorothy looked at the garden, at the spent blooms she had not yet cleared, at Harold's fence posts at the edge of the property, the ones he had repainted 4 summers ago, because he said good fence posts were a courtesy to the neighbors. She said, is Noah at the hospital now? Waiting room, 3rd floor, building B. I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She went inside, washed her hands, changed her shoes, took her purse and her keys. She did not stop to think very carefully about whether this was reasonable because it was obviously the obvious thing to do, and she had been married for 41 years to a man who drove down embankments in the dark because it was the obvious thing to do, and she thought she had learned at least that much from him. She found Noah exactly where Wade had described him. 3rd floor waiting room, building B, the ICU family area with its worn chairs and institutional carpet. He was in the corner chair, the right-angled chair against 2 walls, the best chair in the room for a child who needed his back covered, and he had the wooden block on his knee and his feet flat on the floor and his eyes on the middle distance. He looked up when she came in. He watched her cross the room. When she sat down in the chair beside him, leaving one empty chair between them, he said, you came. I did, she said. Dad called you. He did. Noah looked at the block on his knee. He doesn't usually call people. I know. He must be scared, Noah said. Yes, I think he is. Are you? Noah turned the block over. Grandpa Hank has always been here, he said. It was not precisely an answer. It was something more accurate than an answer. Dorothy understood. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, my husband Harold had a brother named Ray who had always been here for 19 years. When Ray died, the hardest part was the always been here part. The room where someone has always been is a different size without them. Noah looked at her with his cataloging eyes. Did the room go back to normal? The room changed. It didn't go back to what it was before, but it became a room I could be in. He thought about that with the serious thoroughness he brought to everything. How long did that take? A while. Different things take different amounts of time, and Grandpa Hank is still here. He hasn't gone anywhere yet. The doctor said serious, Noah said. Serious means they're paying close attention. Serious means they're working hard. I was a nurse for 35 years. Serious is a word they use when they're not giving up. Noah looked at the door that led to the ICU corridor. It has sounds in there. The machines, yes. They beep and hiss and click. It can be a lot. I went in once. For 2 minutes, the sounds were too much. He turned the block. But Grandpa doesn't know I was there. I didn't stay long enough. Dorothy looked at him. Would you like to try again? I can go with you. His grip on the block tightened. What if it's too much again? Then we come back out, she said simply. That's always an option. We can go in for 1 minute or 30 seconds. We can stand at the door and not go past it. There's no version that requires you to stay longer than you can. He was quiet for a long time. In the waiting room, a television played at low volume in the corner, and there were 2 other families at other ends of the space, a woman knitting a teenage boy with headphones. Nobody paying attention to anyone else in the particular exhausted way of people deep in a hospital ward. Wade came through the door from the corridor and stopped when he saw Dorothy. He was wearing the same boots as the wedding, different jeans, a gray shirt. He looked like a man who had been sleeping in the same clothes for several days, which was probably accurate. He said, Dorothy. He said it with a roughness that contained something larger. Dorothy, she confirmed mildly for the 2nd time. He looked at Noah. You all right, bud? She said we could go in for 30 seconds, Noah said. And if it's too much, we come back out. Wade looked at Dorothy. She nodded. Wade crouched in front of his son the way he had crouched at the wedding, hands open and near. You don't have to, Noah. I told you that. I know, Noah said. But Grandpa doesn't know I was there before. I want him to know. Something moved in Wade's face. He held it very still. Okay, he said. Whenever you're ready. They went in together, the three of them. Noah between Wade and Dorothy, the wooden block in his left hand. The ICU corridor had the sounds Dorothy knew from 35 years. The persistent rhythm of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the low voices of nursing staff, the specific quality of air that was filtered and recycled and slightly different from the air outside. She breathed it without flinching, the way old nurses do. She watched Noah breathe it. He slowed down when the first monitor beep reached them. His hand tightened on the block. She did not reach for his hand. She walked beside him and let her footstep be steady and even, and gave him the rhythm of someone who was not afraid of this corridor. Wade's hand was near his son's shoulder, near not on. They came to the room. Room 14. Dorothy saw the number and felt a small internal thing that she did not examine. Harold had died in room 14 at Mercy General. Different hospital, different building, same number. The world arranged its coincidences without asking permission. She breathed that too. Through the glass panel, they could see Hank Holloway. He was a large man going smaller, which was how Dorothy always thought of serious illness, the way it borrowed from a person before it was done. But his face was recognizably the face Wade's face would be in 25 years, and she could see in it, even in sleep, the patient stillness that Wade had described as the thing Noah trusted. Noah pressed close to the glass. He looked at his grandfather's face for a long time. His breathing was audible and controlled the counting breath of a child managing, and Dorothy stood beside him and let him manage. He said barely above a whisper, Grandpa. The man in the bed did not stir. The monitors tracked on. Noah put his palm flat against the glass. He held it there. Then he turned around and walked back down the corridor to the waiting room, and Dorothy walked with him, and when they sat back down in the corner chairs, he put the wooden block on his knee and said, He knows. Dorothy said, Yes, I think he does. Noah turned the block over once. Then he said, Can we get something from the cafeteria? I'm hungry. Wade, standing in the doorway from the corridor, closed his eyes for a half second. When he opened them, they were very bright. Yeah, bud, he said, let's go find something. They ate in the hospital cafeteria at a corner table near a window. The food was institutional and adequate, and Noah ate it with the focused efficiency of someone making up for several days of not bothering. He had scrambled eggs and toast and a cup of orange juice, and halfway through he put the wooden block on the table beside his plate with a deliberateness that suggested this was a considered choice, that the block was resting while he did not need it. Wade watched this without commenting. Dorothy drank terrible hospital coffee and thought it tasted fine. After Noah finished eating, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, Dad says you were a nurse. For 35 years, Dorothy said. Did people get better? Often, not always, but often. Did you know when they would? She thought about how to answer honestly. Sometimes I could tell. You develop a sense for it. A stubborn person fights differently than someone who's ready to go. Your grandfather looks stubborn to me. Noah looked at her. He is stubborn. He argued with the mailman for a year about the way he folded letters. Dorothy said, That's a very good sign. The smallest thing happened at the corner of Noah's mouth. After a moment, he said, Did Harold argue with anyone? With me, she said. Regularly, mostly about sensible things. Whether the garden needed more irrigation, whether 3 cups of coffee a day was too many, and once for about 2 years about whether the barn door should be painted red or green. What color did he want? Green. He said it would match the fields. I said the fields were already green and didn't need the barn's help. Noah looked out at the parking structure with the expression of someone filing information for future consideration. He said, I think green would have looked nice. Wade made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that Dorothy counted it. She stayed at the hospital another 2 hours that afternoon. She sat with Noah while Wade went back to Hank's room. She taught him a simple card game using a deck she had found in the waiting room's communal supplies basket, a thing she had done hundreds of times in 35 years of hospitals when a child needed something to put their hands to. He learned it in 4 hands and won the 5th. You changed the rules on me, she said. He looked at her. I played the rules as stated. You found a gap in the rules as stated. He considered this. Is that the same as cheating? No, she said. That's called reading the situation. It's a good skill. He took the cards she dealt him and arranged them with the methodical precision he brought to all organization. My dad does that. At the shop, when something is broken, he doesn't always fix it the way it was supposed to work. He fixes it so it works better than it was supposed to. Dorothy said, "That's a very good thing to be able to do." He learned it from my grandfather. Grandpa Hank always said the manual is where the factory stopped thinking. The mechanic is where the thinking continues. Dorothy was quiet for a moment with her cards. She thought about Ray, who had developed approaches to daily difficulties that no occupational therapist had ever suggested, and that worked with a specificity the standard methods had not managed. She thought about Harold, who had fixed the barn's east drainage system using a method that no agricultural pamphlet would have recognized, but that had functioned without failure for 26 years. She laid down her cards and conceded the hand. "He's right about that too," she said. When Wade came back from the room, his face was calmer than it had been. Not because the news was better, but because he had been with his father, and the being with was its own kind of work and its own kind of relief. She left them at 4 and drove back to the farm and deadheaded the last of the garden in the Waswanishi afternoon light and made herself dinner and called Cassie and told her only that she had run into one of the wedding guests who had a family situation and that she had helped a little. Cassie said it was absolutely all right, and then said in the careful way she had been using with her mother for 3 years, "Are you doing okay, Mom?" Dorothy said she was doing fine, which was the most accurate thing she could say. She went back to Miami Valley every day for the next 4 days. Not because Wade asked her. He had called the first time with a specific request, and she had answered it, but after that she came because it was obvious to come. Noah was eating now and winning at cards and talking in his precise, careful way about what the doctors were doing and what the monitors showed. Wade was doing what parents do in hospitals, holding the whole shape of the world together for their child, while everything in them was pointed at the room down the corridor. She knew that work. She had done half of it with Harold the winter. Ray had his first serious respiratory crisis. You could not be the person who made the scary place less scary for the child and also the person who fell apart in the corner. So she came and she sat with Noah, and Wade could fall apart in the corner when he needed to without the boy watching. On the third day, Wade came out of Hank's room and sat beside Dorothy in the waiting room and said nothing for about 5 minutes while Noah slept in the corner chair with the wooden block under his palm and the card game half finished on the seat beside him. Then Wade said quietly, so as not to wake the boy, "There's a situation at the club." Dorothy said, "Tell me." He looked at the floor. "The Ironbound has been my club since I was 21. 27 years. My father was in it before me. My grandfather before that. It has meant structure and loyalty and being the person who shows up." He turned his water bottle in his hands. "There's a group of newer members. They came in the last 3 years. They want to push my father out. Hank still carries honorary membership. He's been in the club for 51 years. They say he's a liability, that the club needs to shed what they call dead weight to move forward." His jaw was very tight. "They called a meeting for next week. A formal vote on club structure. A vote they are holding while I'm on leave at this hospital." Dorothy said, "Who speaks at this meeting? Members, officers, anyone who holds standing." "Do you hold standing?" "I'm sergeant at arms, or I was. I'm on leave while my father's in the hospital." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She looked at Noah asleep in the corner with the block under his palm. She thought about Harold and the embankment and the jacket. She thought about Ray in the barn with a roller and a paint tray, and Harold beside him not filling the silence with words Ray didn't need. She said, "I would like to come to that meeting." Wade looked at her with his direct dark eyes. "You're not a member," he said. "No, but I'm the widow of the man who pulled your father's son out of a ditch in 1999. And I have 35 years of experience making the case for people who other people have decided are inconvenient." She paused. "And I'm good at it." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's not a safe room," he said. "I've spent 35 years in rooms where people are afraid," she said. "Fear makes rooms feel unsafe. It doesn't make them actually dangerous. Most people in a room vote with whoever makes them feel less afraid. I know how to do that." Wade turned the water bottle over in his hands. He looked at his sleeping son. He said, "You don't owe us this." "No," she said, "I don't." She paused. "Harold pulled you out of that ditch because it was the obvious thing to do, not because he owed you anything. He didn't know you." She looked at the water bottle in his hands. "I'm here because it's the obvious thing to do." Something in his shoulders released the same half inch she had watched Noah's shoulders release in the kitchen corridor. the same posture, the shape of letting go of something held too long. He said, "The meeting is Thursday. I'll be there at 6:30, she said. "Show me where to be and what to know." On the fourth day, Hank Holloway opened his eyes and asked for coffee. The nurse said no coffee in the ICU. Hank responded with what Wade reported as a very specific kind of silence, indicating this was not over. Noah, when told, was quiet for a moment, then he said, "He's arguing." "Yes," Dorothy said. "That's a stubborn thing." "Yes." Noah put the wooden block on the table in front of him with the finality of a decision. "Okay," he said. "He's going to be okay." He said it as fact rather than hope. And Dorothy said, "Yes, I think he is," and let Noah have the fact of it. The Ironbound MC Clubhouse was on a street off Gettysburg Avenue, a low cinder block building with a metal roof and a parking lot that on Thursday evening held 37 motorcycles in 2 rows arranged with the particular care of people who took the parking of their bikes seriously. Dorothy parked her gray Civic at the edge of the lot and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She had dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a cream blouse, a cardigan the color of oatmeal. She looked like what she was, a 72-year-old woman who had spent her career in professional settings and knew how to carry herself in rooms designed to make her feel small. She had been in rooms like that. She had not felt small in them. Harold's watch on her wrist. Wade was waiting at the door. He looked like a man holding himself very straight against wind. He said, "You sure about this?" "I've been sure about things that were harder than this," she said. "Let's go in." Inside was a large open room with folding tables pushed against the walls and chairs arranged in rows facing a raised platform at the far end. About 40 men ranging from their 30s to late 60s. A few women at the sides. The air was close with cigarette residue and the particular smell of a room where people had been gathering for decades. Every head turned when Dorothy walked in with Wade. She had expected this. She let them look. She found a chair in the 3rd row, not the front and not the back, and sat down in it with the ease of a woman who had spent 35 years walking into rooms full of strangers and knowing exactly where to put herself. The man on the platform was named Garrett. He was in his late 30s, broad through the chest with the energy of someone who had spent a long time wanting to be in front of a room and had recently arrived there. He called the meeting to order with the organized confidence of someone who had rehearsed this evening. The new resolution came 40 minutes in. Restructuring of honorary membership. The language was clean in general, but the specific application was clear to everyone in the room. Several men spoke in favor. The words they used were about the future, about momentum, about not being weighted down. Nobody spoke against it. The room had the particular silence of people who have opinions and have also calculated what those opinions will cost. Dorothy stood up. Garrett looked at her with the look of a man recalibrating. "I'm Dorothy Keller," she said. Her voice carried the way it had carried through 35 years of wards and corridors and family consultations in difficult rooms. "I'm the widow of Harold Keller. I have a reason to be here, and I'd like 2 minutes to explain it." Garrett said, "Ma'am, this is a members-only meeting." "I know. I'm asking for 2 minutes as a guest, which is a courtesy clubs extend when they have reason to." "I think you have reason to." She looked at him steadily. "I'll be quick." There was a brief consultation among the officers on the platform. The older members in the room, the ones who had been watching quietly since she walked in, had a particular attentiveness about them. One of them, a man in his 60s with gray hair cut short and a jacket weathered to the point of softness, gave Garrett a look that Garrett apparently could read because he said 2 minutes. Dorothy turned to face the room. Not the platform. The room, the rows of chairs and the people in them, because that was who the meeting was actually for. She said, "In November of 1999, a 23-year-old member of this club drove off Route 40 on a cold night and ended up in a ditch with his bike on top of him and the temperature dropping. He was alone in the dark for the better part of an hour. My husband, Harold Keller, who was driving home from visiting his brother at a care facility, saw the tire tracks in the fence and pulled over. He went down the embankment without a flashlight. He got the young man out and drove him to warmth and stayed with him until help came. He gave him $60 in his jacket. He never knew the young man's name. The room was very still. That young man told me last week that he spent the next year getting sober, and the year after that becoming the man he had decided to be because of one stranger who stopped on Route 40 without asking questions. He told me he believed Harold had saved his life. Not just that night. in the way that some acts of ordinary grace change the direction of a person's living. She let the silence have a moment. That young man is Wade Holloway. His father, Hank, has been in this club for 51 years. Hank is in Miami Valley Hospital right now, with his heart working hard to keep him here. And this club is considering removing his name from its rolls while he's in that hospital because some of you have decided he has become inconvenient. She did not make her voice sharp. She made it level, which was harder, and cut deeper. I was a nurse for 35 years. I spent that time watching what happens to people when the institutions they belong to decide they've outlived their usefulness. And I'll tell you what I observed in all that time. She looked at the rows of faces. The person who gets discarded is rarely the one damaged most. The people who do the discarding carry it. It becomes part of how they understand themselves, and it is very hard to unlearn. She looked at Garrett on the platform. My husband stopped on Route 40 because he believed the obvious thing to do was stop. He raised a daughter and cared for a brother and worked a gas station for 32 years and never once made a speech about any of it. He just did the obvious things. She paused. I'm asking you to do the obvious thing. Hank Holloway is not dead weight. He's the 51 years of this club's history that you are standing on, whether you know it or not. You can vote to remove him, and that vote will mean something about who you are. Or you can table it and call his son tomorrow and tell him his father's name is safe. That will also mean something about who you are. She sat down. The room did not make a sound for about 4 seconds. Then the gray-haired man in the weathered jacket stood up. He said his name was Briggs, and he had been in the Ironbound MC for 34 years, and he moved to table the resolution pending the outcome of Hank Holloway's hospitalization. Another man seconded it. Garrett looked at the room. The room looked back at him. The vote to table passed with 31 in favor and 6 against and 3 abstentions. Dorothy drove home in the dark with Harold's watch on her wrist and the windows down and nothing in particular playing on the radio. She thought Harold would have been embarrassed by the speech. He would have said she made more of him than he was. She thought he probably would have driven back to the farm a little faster than usual and made coffee for 2 and talked about anything else entirely. She would have let him, and she would have known what she knew. Hank Holloway came home from Miami Valley Hospital 11 days after the heart event. He came home on a Tuesday, which Dorothy thought was a good day for coming home, a working day, a day that asked things of you and thus gave you something to push against. Wade called her that evening. He's home, he said. His voice was different from the first call. The careful control replaced by something quieter and more real. Good, she said. He wants to meet you. He says any woman who walked into an Ironbound meeting and made Garrett look like a student deserves proper introduction. Dorothy said, that's a very kind description. It's accurate, Wade said. How was Saturday? Saturday came in cool and bright, the particular kind of October morning in Ohio that felt like the season making good on a promise. Dorothy brought a pound cake. She had made it Friday evening because baking was the thing she did when she needed her hands busy and her mind working through something at the same time. The cake was simple lemon, the kind that kept well and traveled easily, and it announced nothing except that someone had taken the time to make a thing with care. The address Wade had given her was a house on the west side, a quiet street of modest houses with good-sized yards, the kind of neighborhood built when people expected to stay. Wade's house was a craftsman bungalow, dark gray with white trim, a motorcycle in the driveway under a canvas cover, a child's bicycle on the porch missing its training wheels. She parked and took the cake and knocked. Noah answered the door. He had been waiting. She could tell from the speed of it. He looked at the cake. That's for eating, he said. It is, she said. Good, he said. He stepped back to let her in. The inside of the house was the inside of a house lived in by a man and a child who did not have anyone to impress. It was orderly in the particular way of people who need order to function rather than order to perform. Books on shelves arranged with consideration, a workbench visible through the kitchen door, with tools hung above it on a pegboard, each outline drawn in marker, so you could see immediately what was missing. A child's drawings on the refrigerator, precise drawings with labels, a motorcycle with all its parts named, a drawing of a man and a boy side by side with the man much taller and the boy holding something that was clearly the wooden block. On the couch sat Hank Holloway. He was a large man, or had been now somewhat reduced by the hospital weeks, but still carrying the frame of someone who had been substantial. He had Wade's face, but older Wade's eyes, but with more years in them. He looked at Dorothy the way his grandson looked at new things. the full cataloging gaze. Then he said in a voice that was still carrying most of its range, "You're the one who walked into the club meeting." "I am," Dorothy said. "I heard you made Garrett feel like a student." "I heard the same thing. I wasn't trying to make anyone feel any particular way. I was trying to make a point." "Did it work?" "Well enough for now." Hank nodded slowly with the nod of a man evaluating. "Wade said you were a nurse. 35 years at Mercy General." "My wife Eloise died at Mercy General, 1993. Cancer. She was 49. Dorothy sat down in the chair across from him that Noah had already clearly designated for her by the angle at which it faced the couch. "I'm sorry, 49 is too young." "Wade was 17, Hank said. Noah never knew her." He said it simply as fact the way the Holloway men said things. Dorothy had noticed this across weeks of knowing them. They were people who stated difficult truths in the same register they stated ordinary ones, which she thought was either a character trait or a thing they had learned by necessity. "Your wife would have been proud of Wade," Dorothy said. "He's a good father." Hank looked at the door to the kitchen where Wade was making coffee. "Yeah, he is." He paused. "He wasn't always sure he'd be. When we first understood what was different about Noah, Wade went very quiet for about a year. I thought I might lose him to it, but he came back different, better, like he'd decided something in there." Dorothy thought about Route 40 in November of 1999, about a man who had spent a year in that same kind of quiet and come back different. Wade brought coffee. They sat in the front room, the four of them, Noah at the far end of the couch with the wooden block and a book he was not entirely reading, maintaining proximity without being in the center of the conversation. She and Hank talked about Mercy General and about the neighborhood and about the winter that was coming, which Hank had opinions about based on the behavior of certain trees he had been observing since 1971. Dorothy said Harold had been the same way about trees. Hank said Harold sounded like a man worth knowing. Dorothy said he was a very ordinary man who was worth knowing very much. Hank looked at her with the considered steadiness of a man who had earned his years. "Wade told me about Route 40, about the jacket." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about that all week, that Harold drove home past Route 40 every time he visited his brother. He would have come past that stretch of road 100 times. The one time he stopped it was for my son." Hank's voice was measured. "I don't know what to do with that." "Neither did I," Dorothy said, "for a day or two. Then I thought Harold was the kind of person who stopped every time. He just didn't always find anyone in the ditch. And the times he did, he didn't make a story of it. He came home and made coffee." She paused. "He was very consistent. That's not a talent. It's a decision made so many times it becomes a nature." Hank looked at his son. "Wade, you'd better know that name." "I know it," Wade said quietly. "Know it the way you know important things," Hank said. "Not just the story, the reason for the story." From the far end of the couch, without looking up from his book, Noah said, "Harold made 2 cups of coffee every morning even when he was alone. That's what Dorothy told me. I thought that was important." Dorothy said it was important. Noah did not look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. After a while, Hank said he needed to rest and said it in the manner of a man admitting to a limitation while also making the admission feel like something he'd decided rather than something imposed on him. Noah brought him the specific blanket from the closet, the right one, without asking. Dorothy noted this. On the porch, Wade said, "Noah talked about you every day while Dad was in the hospital. He would be quiet for hours and then he would say something you had told him. About Ray, about the ward, about Harold." Dorothy looked at the child's bicycle missing its training wheels. "When did he learn to ride without them?" "June," Wade said with the particular pride of a parent describing an ordinary miracle. 3 weeks of trying. He fell a lot. He didn't quit." "No," she said. "I wouldn't expect him to." She drove back to the farm with the afternoon light in her eyes and a feeling in her chest that was not uncomplicated. A good feeling, but with texture to it, the texture of things made partly of loss. Harold was not here for any of it. She let herself feel that on the drive home. Not the managing version of it, just the fact of it. The second vote at the Ironbound MC happened in November. By then, Hank had been home for 6 weeks and had been seen around the neighborhood at the shop at the things that stubborn men who argue with nurses about coffee come back to. His presence had done what presence does. It had made him real again to the people who had been abstracting him into inconvenience. Wade called Dorothy the morning after. He said the resolution failed. 11 in favor, 29 against 5 abstentions. Dorothy said, "Good. Garrett's not happy." Garrett's 25 years from where your father is, Dorothy said. He'll understand it eventually or he won't. 37 motorcycles came to the farm on a Saturday in late November. They came the way Wade had told her they would come slowly and in columns, and the sound built from a low rumble at the road to something you felt in your chest before you heard it clearly. Dorothy stood at the gate with Cassie on her left and Connor on her right and Harold's watch on her wrist. Hank Holloway was near the front, moving carefully, Wade riding beside him close enough to be there if needed. Noah was not on a motorcycle. He was in the sidecar of a vintage rig she had not known Wade owned, wearing a small helmet and holding the wooden block with both hands, and his eyes very wide. They pulled to a stop in the drive and the engines went quiet one by one until there was only the sound of the field and the distant trees. Wade walked up to the gate. Hank walked with him slowly. Wade said, "This is Hank Holloway, my father." Dorothy offered her hand. Hank took it in both of his large worn hands and looked at her and said, "You kept his name good." Dorothy said, "He kept it himself. I just reminded people what it was." Hank reached into his jacket pocket and brought out an envelope, held it out. "The club voted. It's a small thing. A fund for the pediatric ward at Mercy General in Harold Keller's name. Wade told us that's where you worked. We wanted to put his name somewhere. It would keep doing what he did." Dorothy took the envelope. She looked at it in her hand. She thought about Harold at 5 in the morning making 2 cups of coffee. She thought about a barn painted red because she was right about the fields not needing help being green. She thought about Route 40 in November and an embankment and a young man who had come back from wherever he went and built something good. She said he would have been very embarrassed. Hank said good men usually are. From the sidecar, Noah's voice clear and carrying in the still morning air, "Dorothy." She looked. He was standing up in the sidecar, one hand on the frame for balance, the wooden block in his other hand. He held the block up. On its face beside Noah and the phone number, there was a small mark she had not noticed before, a line drawn in pencil, careful and deliberate. She said, "From where Ray and Harold stood." "From where they started," he said. "I wanted to remember where things begin." Dorothy stood at the gate of Harold's farm with 37 motorcycles in her drive, and her daughter behind her and Hank Holloway in front of her, and the November field cold and pale and stretching out beyond them all. She said to Noah, "You keep it. You know where things start. That's important." He looked at the block, turned it over once, and held it against his chest with both hands the way he held it when it was the most needed thing. Then he said clear and simple, and aimed at her across the November air, "Thank you for dancing with me." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She had not danced with him. She had walked beside him. She had sat with him in a kitchen and talked about blocks and notebooks. She had not danced, but she understood what he meant. She understood that for Noah, the word dancing covered all the things that some people did with their bodies and others did with their presence. The act of being in motion beside someone through something that would have been harder alone. She said, "Thank you for asking." He sat back down in the sidecar. Wade started his engine. The others followed one by one, the sound building back into the chest-felt rumble. They turned in the drive and filed back out onto the county road, and the sound of them diminished slowly down the road toward town until it was gone. The field was very quiet. Dorothy stood at the gate for a moment with Harold's watch warm on her wrist and the November air on her face and the envelope in her hand. She turned back toward the house. Cassie put her arms around her mother and said into her shoulder, "Dad would have been so proud of you." Dorothy said, "I didn't do anything. I just talked to people." "Mom," and made one speech. "Mom," and brought a pound cake. Cassie laughed, wet and full, her daughter's laugh unchanged since she was 7 years old. Dorothy let herself be held. Then she said, "There's more coffee inside. Your father's pot is still good." They went in. Dorothy set the envelope on the counter beside Harold's watch and made coffee for 1 extra in the old habit, and they sat at the kitchen table while the November light moved across the floor and the east field held its pale, cold stillness. She thought Harold made 2 cups every morning because he was a man who expected the world to include someone beside him. He had been right about that for 41 years. He had gone on being right after. She put her hand on the watch on her wrist. She kept it there for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and talked with her daughter and let the afternoon be what it was. In the spring, when Cassie's pregnancy was beginning to show and the east field was coming back green, Noah asked Dorothy one more question about Harold. They were at the kitchen table with the cards between them and the afternoon light coming through the window. Wade in the other room on his weekly hour-long call with Hank. Noah said, "Did Harold know that the things he did kept going after he died?" Dorothy looked at her cards. She set them down. She said, I don't think he thought about it that way. He wasn't a man who thought much about legacy. He thought about what was in front of him. Noah turned the wooden block over. But they do keep going. The things people do keep going even when they don't. Yes, Dorothy said, they do. He was quiet for a moment, arranging his cards with the methodical precision she had come to know. Then he said, I'm going to do things that keep going. He said it the way he said most important things, simply as a fact, as a decision already made that he was now stating for the record. Dorothy looked at him across the kitchen table. This boy with his wooden block and his cataloging eyes in his small, serious face. This boy who had stood at the edge of a dance floor in a barn and moved from one foot to the other while a slow guitar played. This boy who had pressed his palm against ICU glass in the dark so his grandfather would know. This boy who had held a pencil mark on a wooden block up toward a barn as a gesture of acknowledgement to a man he had never met and would carry with him all his life. She said, I know you will. He turned a card down. Okay, he said, your play. She picked up her cards. Outside the kitchen window, the April field was very green. The way Harold had always said it would be green enough for two of everything. Green enough to see from the road, green enough to last the whole long summer and deep into the fall. Green, the way good things are green when they have been tended properly and given time and left to do what they were always going to do if only someone would let them. She played her card. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The coffee was warm. That winter, Noah asked his father on a Sunday afternoon while they were working in the garage together what Dorothy's husband had been like. Wade thought about it for a long time, which was the Holloway way of answering questions that deserved it. He said he was a man who stopped. Noah turned this over. When he saw something that needed stopping for, Wade said, he stopped. And he didn't make a thing of it. He just did it and went on. Noah held the wooden block in his palm. Like you, Noah said. Wade was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has been told something true that he is still learning to carry. I'm working on it, he said. Noah turned the block over. On the face with the pencil mark, the mark from the corner of the barn where Harold and Ray had stood with a paint roller in the summer the fields were green enough. He traced it once with his thumb around and around until the world was the right size. Okay, he said. They went on working. Outside the garage window, the Ohio winter was coming in slow and gray, and certain the way Ohio winters come, and the motorcycle under its canvas cover waited for the season to turn, and somewhere across the city, in a farmhouse on the edge of the east field, a woman was up at 5, making coffee, 1 cup, and standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky come up and finding it as she always found it enough. One thing at a time. Feet on the floor. Stop when someone is in the ditch. The road ahead. That was enough. It had always been enough. The days between the wedding and the first hospital call had their own texture different from the texture of the wedding evening itself. Dorothy had learned over 35 years that sustained care asked different things of you than a single acute moment. Emergencies asked for speed and precision and the trained suppression of your own response. The long work asked for something else entirely, the ability to come back and come back again, without the edge wearing off, without the care becoming performance. She was good at that. She had been good at it since she was 23 and brand new to the pediatric ward and had pulled a chair to the bedside of a small boy at 3 a.m. because he was awake and afraid and his parents had gone home and the ward was quiet and there was nothing medically indicated. No procedure to perform, no intervention to document, just a child in the dark who needed someone in the room. She had sat there for an hour and 40 minutes, and the boy had fallen asleep, and she had walked back to the nurse's station and written nothing in the chart because there was nothing to write. That was the whole story. She had decided then what kind of nurse she would be and what kind of person, and she had been consistent about it for a long time. Harold had loved that about her. He had said once late in their life together that the most remarkable thing about her was not her competence, which was obvious and considerable, but her consistency. That she showed up the same way every time. That the people she cared for could count on the same Dorothy in the hard moment as in the easy one. He said this the way he said most important things, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation he had been sitting with for some time and had finally found the words for. She had told him she didn't know what he was talking about. He had smiled and gone back to his book. She thought about that now in the garden on a Thursday morning, with her phone warm in her apron pocket, and the spent blooms in her gloved hand. She thought about consistency and what it cost and what it was worth and how you got it. She thought you got it the same way you got anything worth having, by deciding early what mattered, and then acting on that decision so many times that it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a nature. That was what Harold had done on Route 40. He had not decided that night to be the kind of person who stopped. He had been deciding it for years before that night, in 1,000 ordinary moments, and by November of 1999, the deciding was behind him and only the doing remained. The phone rang. She pulled off one glove and answered. The hospital waiting room on the third floor of Building B was the same room she had walked into and out of hundreds of times in her career, wearing different clothes on a different side of the bed. The carpet was the color of old sage. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric designed to be durable rather than comfortable, which it achieved at the full expense of the second quality. The television in the corner played something with the sound off. The window looked out on the parking structure with its gray geometries. She had always thought hospital waiting rooms were among the most honest rooms in any building. They asked nothing of you except your presence. You did not need to perform anything here, did not need to make conversation or manage an impression or hold a particular expression. People in hospital waiting rooms were stripped of the usual social requirements, and what you saw was what was actually there: the exhausted daughter, the frightened husband, the teenager whose phone was a wall between himself and the fact of where he was, the old woman working her way through a rosary with the patient repetition of someone who has been working her way through rosaries since before most people in the room were born. Noah was in the corner chair, the right one, the one against two walls. She had thought he would be. She had sat with him for an hour before Wade came out of the corridor. She had not initiated conversation. She had simply occupied the chair beside him with the same quality of presence she had learned on the ward, inattentive and unhurried, available without being insistent. After about 15 minutes, Noah had said without preamble, "The clock on the wall is 14 seconds fast." She had looked at the clock. She had looked at her watch. She said, "You're right, 14 seconds, maybe 15. "It bothers me," he said. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." She paused. "Would it help to sit where you can't see it?" He looked at the clock, then at the window, then at the door to the ICU corridor. "No," he said, "I want to see it. I just want to know it's wrong." She thought about that for a while. She thought about all the clocks that ran wrong, and all the instruments that gave imprecise readings, and all the information that was slightly off, and how you had to know which things were reliable and which were not, and calibrate accordingly. She said, "That makes sense, better to know." He turned the wooden block over in his hands. "My grandfather says that about most things. Better to know even when it's hard." "He's right," Dorothy said. "He's usually right," Noah said. "He was wrong about the motorcycle the winter before last. He said it didn't need the rear brake line looked at, and then the rear brake line needed to be looked at." "How did he handle being wrong?" "He said he was wrong and he looked at the brake line." Noah turned the block. "That's all? He just said it and then he fixed it." Dorothy said, "That's a good way to be wrong." Noah looked at her. "Is it hard to do?" "For most people," she said. "It gets easier with practice." He considered this. "I'm practicing," he said. He said it with the same matter-of-fact directness he brought to all self-assessment, no performance of modesty, no inflation. Just the straight report of someone taking stock. "I know," Dorothy said. "I can tell." When Wade came out, his face was the face she had been reading all week. The careful control of a man who has rationed himself very strictly because he does not know how long the ration needs to last. He had that specific exhaustion behind the eyes that she associated with the third and fourth day of vigil, the day when the initial sharp adrenaline had passed and the body had to find some other fuel. She said, "Go get something to eat. I'll stay with Noah." He looked at his son. He looked at Dorothy. He said, "I'm not hungry." She said, "I know. Go get something anyway." He went. She watched him disappear down the corridor toward the elevator, and she thought he is doing what people do when they are the only one. He is making himself as small as possible so that everything he has can go toward his son and his father. He is operating on a minimal fuel budget because he has decided everything else is secondary. She had seen this before. She had seen it end badly, and she had seen it end less badly. And the difference was almost always whether someone arrived to tell the person they were allowed to eat. She was good at that too. The days continued. On the third day at the hospital, a young nurse on the ICU floor, a woman in her late 20s named Priya, with a precise and businesslike manner that Dorothy recognized as the characteristic professionalism of someone who loved their work and took it seriously, stopped Dorothy in the corridor and said, "Are you family?" Dorothy said, "I'm a friend. I was a nurse here for 35 years." Priya looked at her for a moment and said, "Ward, pediatrics, before your time." Priya nodded, which was the nod of someone filing information rather than concluding a conversation. She said, "The boy Noah, he's been in the waiting room every day." "Yes. He asked me this morning what the machines do, the specific machines, what each one monitors." She paused. "I told him he asked good follow-up questions." Dorothy said, "He usually does." Priya looked at the door to room 14. "Mr. Holloway Sr. is doing better than we expected at this stage. He's argumentative, which in my clinical experience is a positive indicator." "Yes," Dorothy said. "I've been telling Noah that." Priya said, "He wanted to know if the machines would tell him when his grandfather got better. I said they would show when his grandfather's numbers improved." She paused again. "He asked if he could come in and watch the numbers. I said I'd ask." Dorothy looked at Priya. She said, "He's been in once for about 2 minutes. The sounds were too much." "I know, he told me." Priya held her clipboard with both hands in the practiced way of someone who had learned to keep their hands occupied in conversations that ran long. "I can turn the monitor volumes down on the secondary machines while he's in the room. The primary cardiac monitor needs to stay audible, but the others can be reduced. It won't affect clinical function." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is a very thoughtful thing to offer." Priya shrugged in the manner of someone deflecting a compliment they don't feel is warranted. "It's a reasonable accommodation. We do it for other patients sometimes." She turned. "Tell me when he wants to try." She went back to her station. Dorothy stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about the 35 years of working with people like Priya and the ones who were nothing like Priya, and how the difference came down always to the same simple thing, whether the person had decided the patient was a human being first or a clinical case first, and how that one decision early in a career determined almost everything downstream. She went back to the waiting room. Noah was still in the corner chair. He had the wooden block on his knee, and he was not looking at the clock anymore. He was looking at the window and the gray geometry of the parking structure. Dorothy sat down. She said, "A nurse named Priya says she can turn the noise down on some of the machines, not all of them. The important one has to stay on, but the others she can make them quieter while you're in the room." Noah looked at her. "She thought you might want to know that," Dorothy said. He was quiet for a long time. He turned the block over. He looked at the clock that ran 14 seconds fast. He said, "Whenever you're ready," she said. He looked at the window again. "Not today," he said. "Maybe tomorrow." "All right," she said. "Will she be here tomorrow?" "I can find out." She found out. Priya was on shift Wednesday and Thursday. She told Noah. He nodded and filed it. Wednesday afternoon, he went in. Priya had done what she said she would do. The secondary monitors were quieter. The room was not silent. The primary cardiac monitor tracked in its steady rhythm, and there were still the sounds of air and machinery, but it was reduced to something that Noah could stand inside without his hands going to his ears. He stood at the foot of his grandfather's bed for 4 minutes. Dorothy counted not from anxiety, but from the habit of counting that came from 35 years of timing things that mattered. 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes longer than his first attempt, which was longer than it needed to be, and shorter than he would have liked, which was exactly right. Hank Holloway's eyes opened once during those 4 minutes. He was not fully awake. He was in the loose half-consciousness of someone heavily medicated and healing the place between sleep and waking, where awareness comes and goes like weather. But his eyes opened, and he turned his head very slightly in the direction of the foot of the bed in the direction of his grandson. Noah saw it. He did not move. He stood very still. The wooden block held against his chest with both hands, and he looked at his grandfather's face, and Hank Holloway's eyes stayed open for about 30 seconds and then drifted closed again. Noah walked back out of the room. In the corridor, he stopped. He stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling and breathed for a long time. Dorothy stood nearby, not speaking, not moving closer, just there. After a while, Noah said, "He saw me." "Yes," she said, "I think he did. He knew I was there." "Yes." Noah took one more long breath. Then he pushed off the wall and started walking back toward the waiting room. At the door, he stopped and looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. It came out clearly, without ceremony, the way the Holloway men said things that cost something. "You did the hard part," she said. He considered this with his customary thoroughness. Then he said, "We both did," and went through the door. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he was gone. She heard the clock on the wall, which she had checked against her watch, and which ran 12 seconds fast rather than 14, which meant either the clock was correcting or she had miscounted, and she stood there in the pale fluorescent light of a hospital corridor on a Wednesday afternoon and felt something she did not immediately name. She named it after a moment. It was the feeling she had felt at the end of good shifts, the ones where something had been given and received cleanly, where the work had done what it was for. She had felt this feeling hundreds of times, and she had never found a better word for it than right. Not good exactly, though it was good. Right. The sense of a thing having gone the way it was supposed to go. She walked back to the waiting room. Wade was there now, had come while she and Noah were in the corridor, and he looked at his son in the corner chair, and then at Dorothy, and she said, "He went in 4 minutes." Hank opened his eyes. Wade sat down in the chair beside his son very slowly, the way people sit when their legs have decided before their minds have caught up. He said to Noah, "You went in." Noah was looking at the clock that ran fast. "He knew I was there," he said. Wade looked at the floor. His hands were on his knees, big hands, mechanic's hands, and they were very still. After a moment, he looked at Dorothy and said quietly enough that it did not reach his son, "I don't know how you do this." She said equally quietly, "You do it for 35 years. Then you keep doing it." He shook his head. He did not mean she had answered the question he was asking. She knew that. She did not have the answer to the question he was actually asking, which was closer to, how do you keep having enough of yourself to give? She did not know the answer to that. She thought the answer might be different for everyone. For her, it had always been that giving made more than it used, that the tank filled as it emptied if you kept it pointed at the right things. She could not know if that was true for other people. She could only know it for herself. She had been doing it for 49 years. The tank was still filling. Hank came home on a Tuesday. He came home the way stubborn men come home from hospitals, which is to say he came home before some of the medical team felt entirely comfortable with the timeline, and precisely when he had decided he was going to, which coincided with the day his cardiologist sat down with him and had a frank conversation about the procedure that had been completed and the recovery that was required, and what reasonable looked like and what stubborn looked like, and where the line was between them. Hank had listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone taking a technical briefing seriously. He had asked 3 specific questions. He had accepted the answers. He had said he would be home Tuesday. He was home Tuesday. Noah went to see him that evening with Wade. Dorothy did not go. This was their thing, the grandfather and the grandson, and the father who had always stood between them as both the connection and the bridge. And it was right that the first evening should be theirs without anyone else in it. Wade called at 9. He said, "Hank wants you to come Saturday." Dorothy said, "Tell him Saturday." He says, "You can bring whatever you want to bring. Tell him I'll bring a pound cake." There was a pause on the line. Then Wade said, "He says that's acceptable." Dorothy said, "Barely." "Yeah," Wade said, "that's what he meant." She made the cake Friday evening with the kitchen radio on low, and the light above the stove warm and yellow, and the smell of lemon and butter filling the old farmhouse, the way good smells do, claiming every room, even the ones you're not in. She made it slowly, which was the only way she made things anymore, not from limitation, but from preference, having discovered somewhere in her 60s that doing things slowly was not inefficiency, but a different relationship with time. One that acknowledged the time was there and used it rather than working against it. Harold had been the same way in his last years. He had moved more slowly through his days than he had at 40, and he had done more in each of them. She had asked him about it once, and he had said, "When you stop rushing, you find out how much room there is in a day." She had not known what he meant until she was 67, and she was glad she had waited to understand it rather than pretending she did. She put the cake onto the counter to cool. She wiped down the counter. She turned off the radio. She stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house to its particular night sounds, the settling of old wood, the refrigerator's steady hum, the tick of the clock that had been on the kitchen wall since 1988, and that kept perfect time. She thought about Hank Holloway at home in his house on the west side, probably arguing with someone about something, probably winning. She thought about Noah in his corner of the couch with the wooden block and the book he read at a remove from whatever the adults were doing. She thought about Wade in the kitchen making coffee the way he had been making coffee every morning for years, for himself and for whoever was there, which was what you did when you were the person who kept things going. She thought about Harold. She picked up her cup. She rinsed it. She turned off the light. She went to bed and slept well. The morning of the MC meeting, Dorothy had thought more carefully about what she was walking into than she had let on to Wade. She had been in rooms full of organized men before. Not bikers specifically, but the same structural principle applied across institutions. Rooms where the hierarchy was implicit and total, where the furniture arrangement told you who mattered and who was a visitor, where the silence in certain corners meant power and the noise in others meant performance. She had been in hospital boardrooms when administrators were deciding things about the ward that would affect her patients, and she had learned in those rooms that the people who controlled the outcome were rarely the loudest ones in them. The loudest people in those rooms were usually the ones who needed to hear themselves be loud. The people who controlled the outcome were watching to see which way the wind was going to go. She had spent the drive to Gettysburg Avenue reviewing what Wade had told her about the club's structure. Garrett was new or ambitious with genuine support among the younger members who had come in during a different era and who had a different idea of what the club should be. The older guard men who had been in the club since the 70s and 80s, men who remembered Hank Holloway when he was the one standing up in front of rooms, were present but not yet organized. They were waiting. The middle ground, the members in their 40s who had come in during a transitional period, were the actual vote. They were the people who would decide, and they were the people who were watching to see which way was safer, which way the room was going to go before they committed. Dorothy had spent 35 years making rooms feel safer. The specific mechanism was simple, and she had known it since her first boardroom in 1984, when she had stood up to present a case for extending the pediatric ward's visiting hours, and had looked out at 12 faces in suits and understood that only 3 of them were actually undecided, and that the other 9 had already chosen their positions, and that her job was not to persuade all 12, but to give the 3 undecided ones permission to choose the position she wanted them to choose. She had done that by making the safe choice obvious, by making it feel like the thing a reasonable person would do, by making the alternative feel like an overreach, like something that would need explaining later. She had won the visiting hours. She had won 9 other things in those rooms over 35 years by doing the same thing. She had lost 4 things she should have won by misreading who the undecided ones were and pitching to the wrong people. She did not intend to misread this room. She parked and sat in the car for a moment. She had dressed carefully, not the sage green dress, conservative slacks, a pale cream blouse, a cardigan the color of winter mornings. She looked like exactly what she was, a 72-year-old woman who had spent her career in professional settings and knew how to carry herself in rooms that were designed to make her feel small. She had been in rooms like that. She had not felt small in them, not because she was immune to the feeling, but because she had long ago decided the feeling was not information. The feeling of being small in a room was the room's opinion of you, not the truth of you. She had stopped treating those 2 things as the same things sometime around 1991. Harold's watch on her wrist. She got out of the car. Inside was a large, open room with folding tables pushed against the walls and chairs arranged in rows facing a raised platform at the far end. She had been in rooms like this too, not exactly but close enough. Rooms with a front and a back, rooms where standing at the front meant something, and sitting in the middle meant something else, and sitting in the very back meant a third thing. She took the same seat she had chosen before, the third row, neither front nor back, and settled into it with the ease of a woman who had spent 35 years choosing the right position in difficult rooms. She looked at the room while Garrett called things to order. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at wards when she came on shift, the quick inventory that registered the whole picture before settling on the details. She noted the older men in the far corners, arms folded, faces calibrated. She noted the younger men near the front, closer to Garrett, animated. She noted the middle section, the people in their 40s, sitting with their bodies slightly turned toward the center of the room, not committed to either side, waiting. She noted one man in particular, gray hair short, jacket weathered to softness, late 60s, maybe older. He sat in the third row on the left side, which was the mirror position of her own, and he was watching the platform with the look of a man who has made up his mind and is waiting for the room to catch up. When Wade came in and took his position along the left wall, this man looked at Wade and gave him a very small nod, and Wade returned it. She thought that man will second the motion when the motion is made. He has the credibility of years. He is the one the middle of the room people will look at when they are deciding which way is safer. He has already decided. She understood what she needed to do and what she didn't need to do. She did not need to persuade the room. The room already had emotion available to it, already had the man who would second it, already had the votes if the votes felt they had permission. She needed only to give the permission. She needed to say the thing that made the obvious choice feel obvious. The resolution came 40 minutes in, and she stood up when the silence arrived, and the silence was the right kind of silence. The silence of a room that has heard something difficult and is deciding whether to say so or stay quiet. And she stood up into it the way she had learned to stand up into difficult silences in difficult rooms. She spoke for about 4 minutes, not 2. Garrett had said 2, and she had said she would be quick, and she had been in the sense that she had not said anything that did not need to be said. She had said the facts about Harold and Route 40 and the jacket. She had said the name Wade Holloway and let the room feel the weight of it. She had said 51 year and let that number sit. She had said the word convenient and then the word inconvenient, and she had let those 2 words do the work that 2 well-placed words can do in a room that is ready to hear them. She had sat down. The gray-haired man had stood up. She had driven home through the dark with the windows down and thought about Harold and about rooms and about what it meant to be the person who gave other people permission to do what they already knew was right. She thought this was not a small thing. She thought it might be one of the most useful things a person could do to stand up in a room and say the obvious thing clearly so that the people in the room who already believed it could find their way to saying it too. Harold had done this on Route 40. He had not made a speech. He had simply done the obvious thing, and by doing it, he had given Wade Holloway permission to believe that obvious things were possible, that the world contained people who stopped that being that person was a choice available to anyone. She had done in the meeting room what Harold had done on Route 40. She had made the obvious thing obvious. She thought he would have found that comparison embarrassing. She thought he would have been right to find it embarrassing. It was too neat. Life was not that neat. But she also thought there was something true in it, something about how certain actions move through time, how a man pulling over on a cold November night in 1999 could end up 30 years later in a room full of strangers through the mouth of his wife and still be doing work in the world. That was not nothing. That was not small. She drove home. She put Harold's watch on the counter and went to bed. And in the morning, she got up at 5 and made coffee 1 cup and stood at the kitchen window and watched the field come light. The Saturday of the tribute ride came after several weeks of the farm being quieter than it had been in a long time, and Dorothy had noticed the quiet without minding it, which was a thing she had been working toward since Harold died, and which she had not always achieved, but was achieving more often now. She thought the quiet was different from loneliness. Loneliness was an absence that called attention to itself constantly, that kept pointing at what was missing. The quiet was simply the space of a life after the most important person in it was gone, and what you did with that space was up to you. She had been filling it these past weeks in ways she had not expected. She had been filling it with Noah's questions and Hank's assessments and Wade's careful sentences in the particular work of being useful to people who were working through hard things. She had also been filling it with the garden and the coffee and the morning window and Harold's fence post standing solid at the edge of the east field. Those things had not stopped being hers just because he was gone. They had been both of theirs, and now they were hers, and she tended them the way she tended everything consistently, without drama, because that was what you did with things worth keeping. Cassie and Connor drove up from Cincinnati on the Friday night before the tribute ride and stayed in the rooms Dorothy had kept ready since the wedding, because she had known in the practical way she knew most things that there would be nights when it made sense for them to be here. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table with the November dark coming in early and the overhead light warm above them, and Connor told a story about a structural problem he had solved at work that made Cassie roll her eyes in a way that communicated both the eye roll and the deep affection underneath it. And Dorothy ate her soup and watched her daughter and thought Harold would have asked him 3 detailed follow-up questions about the structural problem. He would have been genuinely interested. He was always genuinely interested in how things held together. She said, "Tell me more about the problem with the joint." Connor looked at her with the slight surprise of a son-in-law who has not yet entirely learned that his mother-in-law means what she says. He told her more about the joint. She asked 2 follow-up questions. They were not the questions Harold would have asked because she did not have Harold's specific vocabulary for structural engineering, but they were real questions that came from real attention, and Connor answered them with increasing enthusiasm. And Cassie looked at Dorothy over the top of her soup bowl with an expression that was too full to name. After dinner, Dorothy washed the dishes while Cassie and Connor sat at the table with their wine, and she could hear them talking behind her, the easy, low talk of two people who had found the right frequency with each other, and she thought this is one of the good things. This particular sound, Cassie's voice in a man's voice that had learned how to be near it. Harold had made this sound. For 41 years, every evening in this kitchen, that sound had been there. She had not known how much she would miss it. She had not known you could miss a sound. She dried her hand and hung the towel and turned around. Connor was telling Cassie something that made her laugh, the real laugh, the one that went all the way through her. Dorothy listened to it for a moment. Then she said goodnight and went to bed and slept with the easy sleep of a woman who had been useful all day and would be useful again tomorrow and was not afraid of that. The morning of the tribute ride, she was up at 5. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the east field and the sky over it come up from dark to gray to the particular cold blue of November in Ohio, the color that felt like it was made of metal, hard and clean, and carrying no warmth but a great deal of clarity. She had dressed in the sage green dress. Cassie had come downstairs at 7 and found her mother in the sage green dress with Harold's watch and had stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without saying anything. Dorothy said it seemed right to close the circle. Cassie said yes. She came into the kitchen and put the kettle on. It does. They had coffee together in the kitchen while Connor slept, which was the particular gift of early mornings before the household woke time that belonged only to the two of them. The particular quality of being mother and daughter in the quiet before the day made demands. Cassie said, "Are you nervous?" Dorothy thought about it. She was not nervous. She was something that was not exactly the same as peaceful, but was in the same neighborhood, a kind of settled quality that came not from the absence of significance, but from having decided somewhere in the preparation that whatever happened would be met as it came. She said, "No, I'm ready." Cassie looked at her for a moment with her architect's eyes, the eyes that assess structure and load and what things were actually made of. She said, "You've been good this fall." Dorothy said, "I've had things to do." "You've always had things to do." "I've had the right things to do," Dorothy said, and thought that was closer to the truth. When the engines came, they came from the direction of the road, a low building rumble that grew as they turned into the long drive, and Dorothy went to the gate and stood at it, and the sound filled the cold morning air and became the chest-felt thing she had not quite expected, the way certain sounds go past your ears and into the part of you that is older than hearing. She stood at the gate. She had stood at this gate in grief and in the long ordinary weather between those two things. She had stood here on the morning of Harold's diagnosis and on the day they brought his things home from the hospital and on the night after the funeral when she had come outside because the house was too full of people and she needed to look at the field. She had stood here on the morning of Cassie's wedding when the light was coming up gray and she was not crying because mornings were not for crying, and she had made herself a promise about that. She stood here now in the sage green dress with Harold's watch, and 37 motorcycles came down the drive in columns, and the sound of them was large enough to hold everything that had happened since September. Large enough to hold Route 40 in November of 1999, and a barn painted red because the fields were already green, and 2 cups of coffee every morning, even when the house was quiet and she stood in it and let it be as large as it was. Noah in the sidecar, wooden block in both hands, eyes very wide. She thought, he is filing this. He is taking inventory of this moment the way he takes inventory of every room. He will carry this in some form for a very long time, the way he carries the pencil mark on the block, the way he carries the knowledge of where Ray and Harold stood in the barn. He is a child who knows where things begin, and he will know where this began. She opened the gate. The conversation between Wade and Hank that Saturday in the front room had a particular quality to it, the quality of two people who had been talking for a long time and had developed across that time a shorthand that looked like silence to anyone outside it, but was in fact a complete language. Dorothy had watched Harold and Ray talk this way for 19 years. The long pauses that were not gaps in conversation but full sentences expressed in a frequency other people couldn't hear. The way a subject could be raised and concluded in a look how an entire history could be communicated in the angle at which a man held his coffee cup. Hank said at one point, looking at his son and not at Dorothy. "You're different." Wade said, "Yeah." Hank said, "Good different." Wade said, "Working on it." They did not explain what they meant. They did not need to. Dorothy understood it anyway from 35 years of being in rooms where people communicated in the frequency under the words. Noah came back into the room from the kitchen where he had gone to look at something on the workbench, carrying a small bolt he had found, and was turning over in his hands the way he turned over the wooden block with the focused tactile attention of someone for whom objects were more reliable than most other things. He sat down on the far end of the couch and held the bolt in his left hand and the wooden block in his right and looked at them alternately. After a while, he said, "This bolt has been over-tightened." Wade looked at it. "Probably. I've been meaning to rethread that fitting." "You should use a thread file," Noah said, "not the die." "I know," Wade said. Noah put the bolt on the couch beside him and went back to the wooden block. He looked at Dorothy. "Did Ray ever fix things?" "All the time," Dorothy said. "He had a particular gift for anything mechanical. He could hear when something was running wrong before the instrument showed it." "Like the clock at the hospital," Noah said. "That ran 14 seconds fast." "Exactly like that," she said. He turned the block. "I can hear things too," he said. "My dad says it's because I pay attention to the actual sound and not just whether something sounds okay or not okay. Most people only listen for okay or not okay. I listen to what the sound is." Dorothy said, "That's a very useful skill." "It's useful at the shop," he said. "I'm not allowed to do work yet because I'm 8, but I can listen." "When you're allowed to do work, you'll be good at it," Dorothy said. Noah considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. "Probably," he said in the tone of someone who does not inflate estimates, not even of themselves. "I'll need practice. Everyone needs practice, even if they're already listening right." "True," Dorothy said. "Your grandfather said something similar about the manual and the mechanic." Noah looked at Hank. "The factory stopped thinking," he confirmed. Hank said, "That's right. Dorothy's husband Harold was the same way." Noah said to Hank, "He fixed the barn's drainage system in a way no pamphlet would have recognized, and it worked for 26 years. Hank looked at Dorothy. "Is that right?" "Exactly right," she said. He looked at the topography of the East Field and the direction of the prevailing weather and designed the drainage accordingly, rather than installing what was standard. The standard system would have failed in the second spring. His ran until 2 years after he died. Hank looked at the wall for a moment. He said, "He sounds like a man who thought about the second spring." Dorothy said, "He thought about the second spring and the third and the one after that. He planted trees that wouldn't give good shade until 20 years after he put them in. He said a man who can't see past his own lifespan was only thinking about himself." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Hank said, "I want to meet him." He said it simply in the present tense, not catching the impossibility of it until a half second after the words were out. The room went very still. Dorothy said, "I think you would have gotten along." Hank looked at his hands. He looked at his son. He said, "I owe him." "You don't," Dorothy said. "Harold didn't keep accounts. He did what he did because it was obvious to do it, and then he let it go. The owing is your thing, not his." She paused. "What you can do is what Wade has been doing. Become the person he assumed you already were. Do the obvious things. That's all he ever wanted from any of it." Hank was quiet for a long time. Outside the house, a car went by slowly and the sound of it faded down the street. The house settled slightly, the particular sound of old houses in cold weather finding their equilibrium. Hank said, "All right." Just that, 2 words in the way the Holloway men said things, not a resolution or a promise or a statement of intent so much as an acknowledgement, a door opening. Dorothy nodded. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. From the far end of the couch, Noah said without looking up from the wooden block, "Grandpa Hank is going to plant a tree." Everyone looked at him. "In the spring," he said, "something that gives good shade in 20 years. I already looked up which ones grow best in Dayton." Hank looked at his grandson. His face did the thing faces do when they receive something unexpectedly precise and true. He said, "What did you find?" "Red oak," Noah said. "Or bur oak. Bur oak is slower, but the acorns are bigger, and the squirrels like them better, and that's probably better for the neighborhood." Hank said, "Bur oak then." "In the spring," Noah said. "In the spring," Hank agreed. Dorothy looked at the front window of the house and the gray November light coming through it and the street outside in the ordinary American neighborhood that would in some spring to come have a bur oak growing in the yard of a house where a man who had come back from wherever he went had planted it 20 years before it would give shade. She thought that is exactly the right thing. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank what was left of it. She set it down. Outside, the November afternoon was moving toward its early dark, the days shortening the way November days do in Ohio, the light going sideways and then going amber, and then burning. Dorothy stood at the front window of the Holloway house for a moment and looked at the street and felt the familiar shape of the season, the way late autumn in Ohio asks something of you, a specific willingness to stay the course, without the encouragement of warmth or light to do the work in the gray. She had always been good at that. She had grown up in this gray and learned to find in it what it actually offered, which was a different thing than what spring or summer offered, but was not less. The gray was honest. The gray showed you what was actually standing and what wasn't. The gray showed you who stayed. She got her coat and her purse and said her goodnights. At the door, Noah appeared beside her. He had the wooden block in both hands. He said, "The same time next Saturday." She looked at him. She said, "If you want." He turned the block over once. "We didn't finish the card game," he said. "We didn't," she agreed. "I was winning," he said. "You were ahead," she said. "That's not the same as winning." He considered this with visible interest, as if she had offered him a genuinely new piece of information rather than a distinction he might have been expected to know already. "What's the difference?" he said. "Being ahead is a fact about where you are right now. Winning is what happens at the end." She put her coat on. "There's a lot of game left." Noah looked at the block, then at her. "Same time next Saturday," he said, and it was no longer a question. She drove home through the November dark and thought about card games and oak trees and the second spring, and what it meant to think past your own lifespan. She thought Harold had been right. It was thinking about yourself if you couldn't see past it. The trees you planted for the shade you'd never sit in. The drainage system that ran 2 years after you were gone. The jacket given to a stranger on Route 40 and worn for 11 years and then kept in pieces. The decision made so many times it became a nature that other people could pick up and carry forward without knowing they were carrying it. The farm drive came up on her left and she turned in, and the headlights swept across the east field, in the fence posts, in the dark bulk of the barn, in the string lights that were off in the cold November night. She parked. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought, "I will come back here every morning at 5. I will make 1 cup and stand at the window and watch the field come light. I will tend the garden in the seasons it needs tending. I will keep Harold's fence posts. I will let my daughter's child come here and run in the east field and learn what a barn smells like and sit in the chairs Harold built. I will do the obvious things." That was the whole of it. That was all it had ever been. She got out of the car. She unlocked the door. She went inside. She hung her coat. She put Harold's watch on the counter. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove and stood in the warm kitchen in the quiet house and listened to the November dark outside the window and the steady tick of the clock on the wall that had kept perfect time since 1988. The kettle came to a boil. She made her tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the east field in the dark. She could not see it, but she knew it was there, the same field it had been in September, when the light was gold and the wedding guests were arriving. The same field it had been in every season since Harold's grandfather broke the ground, and Harold's father built the barn, and Harold and Ray painted it red while she watched from the same window with her hands around a cup she hadn't bothered to count. It was there. All of it was there. She put her thumb against the counter where the watch had been and stayed there for a moment in the quiet kitchen with her tea warm in her hands and the field dark outside and the clock ticking on the wall. Then she turned off the light and went to bed. She slept well. In the morning, she would be up at 5. She would make coffee, 1 cup, and stand at the kitchen window and watch the sky come up over the east field gray first, and then the thin cold blue of November, and then whatever light the day decided to give. She would be ready. She was always ready. One thing at a time, feet on the floor. That was enough. It had always been enough. It would always be enough. The week after the tribute ride, Dorothy received a letter in the mail from the development office at Mercy General. It was a formal letter, the kind printed on hospital letterhead with the logo in the upper left corner, and the careful language of institutions acknowledging gifts. The letter acknowledged the donation from the Ironbound MC and confirmed the establishment of the Harold Keller Fund for Pediatric Care, and said the first disbursement would support the ward's Family Resource Library, which had been underfunded for 3 years and which now would have new materials and a better space. Dorothy read the letter at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. She thought about the Family Resource Library. She had used it herself in the early years of Ray's care, before she had built the knowledge she would eventually have. She had sat in the small room off the pediatric ward with its outdated pamphlets and its worn-spine books and tried to understand what her husband's brother needed and what the world could offer him and what the gap between those two things might look like over a lifetime. She had found some of what she needed and not found other things, and she had gone looking elsewhere for what wasn't there. She thought about the parents who would sit in that library now, the ones who were where she had been in 1988, trying to understand, trying to find the shape of the life they were now inside. She thought about the ones who would find in that library something that helped them, the ones who would not feel quite so alone in the room. She thought about Harold making coffee for two every morning and how the second cup was never wasted. She folded the letter, she put it in the drawer with the envelope from the tribute ride and Harold's watch and the things that were most his. She closed the drawer. She went outside. The November garden was finished for the year, put to bed, the way she put it to bed every fall. The perennials cut back and mulched the beds, edged and cleared. The fence posts stood at the edge of the east field exactly as Harold had left them, which was to say, exactly as they needed to be. She walked the length of the fence, the way she sometimes walked it in the mornings, touching each post lightly as she passed. Not for any reason she could have named, except that it was the thing she did. She stopped at the far corner, the southeast corner, where the fence turned toward the barn. She stood there and looked at the field and the barn and the farmhouse and the string lights that were off in the daylight, but that she had been turning on in the evenings because November was dark early and the lights made the farm look the way it looked when Harold was alive, which was inhabited and warm. She turned and walked back toward the house. At the door she stopped and looked at Harold's watch on her wrist and the field behind her, and the sky over the field, the high pale November sky of Ohio, and she thought, this is what it looks like from here. This is the view from the middle of a life that is still going. She had expected it to look different. She had not known what she expected exactly, only that she had thought widowhood would feel more like an ending. It did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation in a different key, the same melody her life had always been, but transposed, played now in a register she had not been in before, in which she was learning day by day, year by year, one cup at a time. She went inside. She made lunch. She called Cassie to hear her voice. She went to the window and watched the afternoon light move across the east field and thought about the spring and the garden and the year ahead. She had things to do. She was ready.